Philip and I are going to talk about 25 minutes about the research and the research report. We'll try and skip fairly quickly over a range of topics and raise some issues that we can then come back and explore the ones that feel most relevant to yourselves in more depth as is useful. So the broad focus of the presentation report is transforming communities and exploring the role of community anchors in relation to public service reform and their potential role in supporting, leading and challenging that reform. So we put all of the question marks in the title just to emphasize it's a developing body of thought and practice, and we're keen to engage in dialogue. So in the presentation we'll cover 5 areas. We'll give some background to the research. We'll give a couple of exemplars to show what we mean by community anchors. We'll look at community anchors briefly in terms of public service reform. We'll look at some of the issues for infrastructure, and we'll come back finally to thinking about community anchors and not only public service reform, but a related social change. So the first of those 5 topics, background to the project. Sorry, going ahead of myself. The research project, we started in 2016, and we aim to look at the role of community anchors in relation to public service reform in Scotland, what they can do and what they could do, and to generate some written outputs, and also to support ongoing dialogue and research with a wide range of stakeholders, going beyond, we hope, the life of what works. The researchers, there were 3 of us, myself, I've got a background in community regeneration and participatory research, Philip Revell, who's an independent researcher from Sustainable Dunbar and a community activist, and Oliver Escobar, who works as a lecturer at Edinburgh University and is particularly concerned for local democratic participation and deliberation of many different types. The background, of course, is the Christie Commission and public service reform in Scotland. The Commission emphasises the role of the community sector, and that quote at the beginning emphasises independent community action and the role, in this case, of community development trusts that we interpreted more widely as community anchors. Although the Commission is often summarised as 4 Ps of partnership, participation, prevention or preventing negative outcomes, and performance, improving performance. It's part of a much richer document than that, and it gives a wider agenda of a more equitable society in which public services, a balanced economy and varieties of empowerment are integrated. And one of those forms of empowerment is localism or community empowerment, and the document gives a rich language around democratic participation and accountability, local resilience and autonomy, and local partnerships and place-based working, co-production. So all very relevant. Just to introduce the concept of community anchors or community anchor organisation, the notion of an anchor is used widely in regeneration internationally as a metaphor, so it can mean many different things. In the UK, for various reasons which I can't go into in this presentation because it's quite long-winded, but the UK community anchor model has grown up, and broadly we summarise this in the report as 3 aspirations: organisations aspiring to be community-led or controlled, so with a robust local community governance, a board and networks, and a financial self-sufficiency that makes it independent of larger local bodies built around community ownership. So that was the first aspiration. The second is for a holistic, multi-purpose, inherently complex range of activities to do with the local economy and sustainable development, local social and welfare development, partnership and participation, community sector development, and local leadership and advocacy. So in a sense, they're kind of hubs of local economic, social, and democratic and environmental development. And the third aspiration is to be there for the long term, to be committed and responsive to the local community and the full diversity of the local community, to be locally credible. In Scotland, most often these organisations take the form of either community development trusts or community-controlled housing associations. But to emphasise, there is a much richer community sector out there hundreds, thousands of community groups and organisations and community enterprises, of which community anchors just are one part, and of which they aim to stimulate a wider growth of the community sector. Our research process and report looked at 6 anchor exemplars. We involved a range of public services and documentation and an advisory group, and our own research experience in thinking in more in depth about those exemplars. And I won't go into detail here, but we aspired to a research that's pragmatic, so useful, participatory, so involved a range of people, and critical, so thinking seriously about the issues. And in the report, section 3 of the report looks at the community, at the Christie Commission and anchors in relation to that. Infrastructure in section 4 to support the development of anchors, and the issue of social change in section 5. Outputs from the report include not from the report, but from what works, include a discussion paper in 2015 that sets the scene, a research report, which is a full report, an executive summary and a briefing, and then a range of dialogue and research activities, events, and this webinar, blog pieces, build towards an ongoing process beyond what works. So that's the first part, first chunk, section A. Section B of the presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about 2 of the community anchor exemplars. As you can see, there are 6 listed there, some in urban environments, some in rural, some in remote, or 1 in remote in South Uist. We're going to focus briefly on Govan Hill and Greenock-a-Coddy. I'll do the first one on Govan Hill, and I'll change to Philip to do Greenock-a-Coddy. Govan Hill is a community just about a mile to the south of Glasgow city centre. So it's very much an urban community. 16,000 people live there in about a square mile. The Govan Hill Housing Association, GHHA, I've put here, is a community, illustrates community-led governance. That first aspiration through it's got a formal management committee and membership. It's got a lot of informal networks, tenants and residents groups, a youth committee, a range of community development and housing related activities, and a community ownership built around a large housing stock, social housing in that community, and a range of property owned by its community development trust. It illustrates that second aspiration for holistic, multi-purpose, inherently complex. It's got a service hub for which it provides housing and welfare services, supports tenants and residents groups, and works in partnership with a range of public services, council and health. It also illustrates that inherent complexity through its Community Development Trust, which is a trading subsidiary which provides an information shop in the community, a range of community development activities and adult learning. It supports the work of System of Scotland and the schools there. It has a community sector development angle through a forum and provides a range of local employment, employability and social enterprise development, including workspaces. And it illustrates the third aspiration for local commitment and responsiveness, in particular by that range of activity it does and its concern for the community diversity. Govan Hill is a very diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic community, but also it illustrates that longevity, that local commitment dates back to 1974, and has continued to work with the community as the community has changed in the last 10 years or so. It's had a particular focus on leadership and advocacy around that private rental housing crisis in the community, which I won't go into depth here, but has involved it in lobbying and advocacy with local and central government, and getting investment from those two bodies and supporting practical development on the ground by bringing private rental tenements into community ownership. At which point I'm going to switch to Philip to do Greenock-a-Coddy.
Yeah, Greenock-a-Coddy is a much younger organisation. It was set up in 2009. Actually, it grew out of the 5 Friends of the Earth group. Their first funded project was in 2010, and they've grown very rapidly since then. So they now have around 15 full-time equivalent staff and a turnover of something in excess of 700,000. They operate in Kirkcaldy, which is a town of about 50,000 people in the south of Fife, and it has a number of pockets of multiple deprivation. So in terms of, if you want to scroll on, James.
Not sure I can. Oh,
yes, yeah, still on your screen. So they run a wide range of projects encompassing food and food growing, energy advice, waste reduction, and community development. Next slide. I mean, the energy advice project in particular is a partnership project which actually runs across the whole of Fife, a partnership with a wide range of both public sector and third sector bodies, including Fife Council, and provides home energy advice and then signposting to support to anybody who needs it, with a particular focus on those in fuel poverty. Next. Around food, they have a number of community gardens, and they're in the process of setting up a community food hub where they run projects such as the Living Well on a Budget programme. And they have acquired now a former asset which was transferred from Fife Council, the former library headquarters, which they are converting into what will be their community food hub. Next. And they do a lot of work with schools and young people, and again in partnership with Fife Council, that they help maintain Dunbar Park. And they do a lot of practical skills training work with kids and young people from deprived parts of the town. Next. So overall, yeah, that they take a multifaceted approach to local development, that they do a lot in terms of liaising with public sector structures through community planning partnerships, various bodies. And they're really normalising discussion about what a greener, fairer future will look like locally. I'll pass back to you there, James.
Okay. So that's our 2 exemplars to get the conversations going. We'll refer a little bit to some of the others as well as we go along. The 3rd section, called Anchors in the Christie Commission Agenda, I'm going to keep this quite brief, but we're looking broadly at how community anchors relate to that agenda of partnership, participation, prevention and performance. Firstly, in terms of local partnership and participation, through the visual here, we're emphasising community anchors as potentially hubs for complex local partnership and participation. The 6 different exemplars weren't all doing the same thing, they're quite diverse, but broadly we've summarised their role in relation to partnership and participation as a range of, they illustrated a range of public service partnerships in relation to community planning, health and social care, regeneration, local schools, housing, community safety. They illustrated a range of participatory activity, diverse community networks, so community organisations and groups, diversity and equalities groups, a wider range of third sector networks. Some of them were involved with community councils and local politicians, and crucially, many of them were working with neighbouring community anchor organisations. And then a third range of collaborative and partnership activity was revealed around local trading activities, to do with a range of funding bodies, local and national, building community resilience through community renewables, local leadership, anti-poverty working, and work relating to local democracy, community plans, community histories, and so on. So kind of rich, complex hubs for local partnership participation. Going to skip the next couple of slides and come to the 3rd of the Christie themes, prevention. briefly, really, in terms of prevention and preventing inequalities, we in the report illustrate two themes. One around their potential, where suitably resourced, to mitigate some of the worst excesses of inequalities, anti-poverty work, through income maximisation, through supporting vulnerable groups, accessing services and welfare, building social capital, and through community-led complex placemaking, which can impact on the local environment, housing, green spaces, local food, energies, and so on. So that's one way they work on the preventative agenda. The second is around they offer leadership and advocacy, and I've already kind of flagged that up with Govan Hill around the housing crisis there. But to use a second example, Storrs Uist in South Uist has had a key role in trying to stop the economic decline and depopulation of 3 islands there. It's been building in partnership with the state a range of infrastructure, including a local harbour, and has had the ferry service from Maleg to Loch Boisdale reinstated, which helps with tourist and related activity and local economic development. So 2 themes around prevention, and then finally coming to the issue of performance and bottom-up approaches to improving performance. I'll just emphasise here that their role in producing community-led plans and visions, which could relate to the local place plans being developed in the planning bill. And one of the, all 6 of the exemplars illustrated informal activity in terms of local planning and development. One in particular had produced a formal plan, Glenboy Community Action Plan, in which it worked with other community sector bodies in the village there to develop an action plan. Better known is the Nielsen Renaissance Town Charter, which is a 20-year vision of in which the Nielsen Development Trust has developed a community plan, and Sustainable Dunbar have also done some work around sustainable action planning. So that's broadly how these anchors are relating, the sort of themes that come out of relating to the Christie Commission. So I'm going to move on to the 4th section and hand back to Philip on infrastructure for community anchors.
Yeah, thank you, James. Maybe the next section of the report really looks at the infrastructure space that community anchors operate within, and highlights some of the barriers and challenges and frustrations that they face, but also some of the opportunities. So firstly, looking at the sort of policy space that they operate within, and clearly, given their wide-ranging agendas and the fact that they're based in communities of place, that they're really affected by all policies that governments bring forward. And they're really, therefore, greatly influenced by and impacted by changes to policy. And we particularly highlight that the effect of changes to support for renewables, for example, which we'll come on to a wee bit later, but also a lot of community organisations have been left picking up the pieces from welfare reform, for example. But in terms of opportunity, community anchor organisations are a huge potential source of expertise and knowledge that could be made much better use of by policymakers, and there's a real scope to make use of this in moving to more bottom-up policy making, which fits with the democratic renewal agenda. And then looking at resourcing, as I mentioned, policies can make a huge difference to the ability of community anchors to generate their own income and build their own long-term financial sustainability. Community renewables provided one very good way that many community anchors have been able to do that in the past, but many have missed out. asset transfer provides another possible route. Just looking at one example of how Huntley Development Trust have managed to do this, they actually very nearly collapsed a few years ago for lack of funding, and then a mixture of serendipity and government support and local land coming available and sort of local visionary leadership meant that they were able to acquire 60 acres of land locally, Green Mars Farm, which they're in the process of developing as an educational and training centre. But more immediately, it's given them land on which to develop a community-owned wind turbine, which again, through support from Strengthening Communities programme and the CARES funding from Scottish Government, and crucially, technical support from Community Energy Scotland, enabled them to just get their community wind turbine in place in time to benefit from renewable energy subsidies. So they have now got a substantial and increasing income from community renewables, which has not only secured their future as a development trust, but it's also developing a local energy economy. And just to emphasise the point that it's really difficult to underestimate how important it is that a community anchor has a long-term reliable income stream if it's going to fulfil its potential as a community anchor organisation, because reliance on short-term project funding is a huge drag. And apart from resourcing the organisation and its development, that the other point we really emphasise is the need to support the people involved. And we highlight the fact that there is already a huge amount of skill within the community sector itself, and there's a great opportunity to really make better use of those skills to set up community sector-led training and skill sharing programs. And we also highlight the need to recognise the contribution that is made by huge numbers of volunteers within these organisations, and that their contribution needs to be better recognised and supported. The other thing we consider is the need for culture change and the way that the public sector relates to the community sector. And we emphasise the need to move from a sort of controlling top-down management approach to one that is much more comfortable with creating conditions in which community action can flourish, and then work with the complexity that results from that. And just to briefly highlight that despite what Works Scotland's logo, this isn't actually the way that the world works in predictable cause and effect ways. Actually, the world is much more complex, set up, much more exciting world of interacting complex systems which behave in unexpected and unpredictable ways. And if we're wanting transformational change, then sometimes we need to let those systems dip into chaos in order to rearrange in a new form. So the final section of the report, we go on to consider local democracy and community resilience, and how we can create a more equitable society, and also then look at how this report can really be part of an ongoing dialogue. So briefly looking at local democracy, in a way, these community anchor organisations, many of them have actually arisen precisely because there is such a gap in local democracy in Scotland at the moment. And they are providing new spaces for participation and deliberation, which are focused on improving local outcomes. We emphasise the need to get away from thinking of democracy in terms of voting every few years, and to recognise that new democratic spaces are emerging locally. And we emphasise the need for new ways of meeting together, and particularly emphasise the potential for more facilitative forms of leadership and setting up meetings so that often conflicting local ideas and priorities can be dealt with creatively to come up with better local solutions. We're then going to talk about community resilience, and we argue in a way, given the uncertain future we face with some of the sort of existential challenges and complex challenges that we face globally, that one of the most important functions that community anchor organisations can perform is to increase their local resilience, so that communities can have the best opportunity to engage with and change and shape the future they want. So that when we do experience whatever unexpected challenges arise in the next while, they can actually be used as a catalyst for transformational local change. And we emphasise that community anchors are, as I said, uniquely placed to support the development of local community resilience, but that does to a large extent depend on them themselves being resilient organisations. But they're already doing a lot to build local social capital and set up more vibrant localised economies. Lastly, we're going to talk about social change and the sort of future we are actually working towards. And basically we suggest that community anchors are providing one expression of a wider global movement for a different, fairer, more democratic, sustainable future, in line with a social commons approach, which is really emphasising well-being and caring, sharing communities as a way of creating well-being. So at roots, really, the rediscovering place as the building blocks of society, and building a social commons, and providing a glimpse of a more hopeful future based on a fairer and more sustainable society.